afternoon, and welcome to another webcast from FACTS Institute for County Government in Tallahassee. I'm Eric Poole, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. And just by way of background, one of our primary goals is to expand learning opportunities for members across the state by offering periodic webcasts on diverse issues important to county governments. These webcasts are typically offered 1 to 2 times per month, and anyone enrolled in our certification program, the CCC or CGE, can earn elective credit when participating in either today's webcast or by viewing any of the previous ones we have archived on our website. And as always, I want to acknowledge and thank UF-IFAS for partnering and sponsoring our education programs. For today's topic, because counties have been going through the budget development and adoption process for the last few months, we thought it would be important to talk about one of the more important revenue sources available to counties, and that's ad valorem taxes. And while counties do have a variety of revenue sources to fund operations and services, property taxes, at least from the public's view, is probably one of the more scrutinized revenue sources. It has certainly been scrutinized by the legislature over the last 20 years. Which has led to a variety of exemptions, and along with other, what I would call checkpoints on local governments who may want to raise additional revenues. And really, I think other than looking at one's trim notice, which the layperson may need help trying to interpret, the appraisal process can appear confusing from the outside, the public. But even the inside, for elected officials, particularly newly elected officials, who must make the hard decision of setting millage rate and eventually passing a budget. So to provide clarity on much of this, the statutory timelines and the various exemptions for county property taxes and the relationship with the tax collector and the Board of County Commission, I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Tim Wilmoth. Tim is the Chief Appraiser with Palm Beach County Property Appraiser's Office. He holds the MA and SRI designation from the Appraisal Institute. MAI is the highest designation you can have. He's been in the appraisal process for about 30 years, and for the last 20 years, he's been doing ad valorem assessments. He has served as an expert witness and testified at appeal hearings, circuit court and federal court. He has worked for both the property appraisers' offices and as a property tax consultant. He's won several awards for property tax related articles. He is a Florida native, a veteran of the United States Navy. Thank you for your service. And with that, I'm going to minimize my screen, Tim. And if folks have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A function, and either I will pick them up or Tim will see them on his end. But Tim, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eric. I appreciate that. And today we are going to talk about property taxes. Super exciting topic. Just kidding. But it is an honor for me to present to you, and I hope I'm able to share some information that everybody will find helpful. Before we get started, I do want to say that if you have any questions during my presentation, feel free to jump in on the chat, and I'll do my best to keep an eye on that during the presentation and try to answer your questions as we go. I am going to save a little bit of time at the end for questions, so if I do miss any, or you think of something along the way, we'll certainly try to tackle it then. As the title indicates, over the next hour, I'll be walking you through the property tax system in Florida. It has become a bit complicated over the years, so hopefully we could shed a little light on the topic today. We will not be talking about COVID in any way, so we have a COVID-free zone for the next hour. So let's get going. Before we get into it, I thought it might be interesting to see where Florida falls in the picture in terms of property taxes. What state do you think pays the most property taxes in the United States? I've listed 5 states here to choose from. This is not interactive. There's no point in touching your screen, but go ahead and make a mental choice and we'll see where it goes. So here we go. So as you can see, it's not California, it's not Texas, it's not Massachusetts, and luckily it's not Florida. That's right, New Jersey has the highest property taxes in the United States. And if you look there on my little chart, you can see Florida ranks 22nd out of the 50 states, not bad. Now, this does not factor in state income tax. I think if that was in the mix, you'd probably see Florida rank at the very bottom in terms of high property taxes. The lowest, by the way, here on this list is Hawaii, with an average tax bill of about $1,324. Now, there's a lot of property tax related events in Florida, but these dates on the screen are really the key dates. All valuation and exemptions are based on a January 1st assessment date. All values are based on the conditions of property as of January 1st. And if you want a homestead exemption, you must live in the home on January 1st. Now in August, the property appraiser sends out trim notices, which tell you how much we have assessed your property for. And it also tells you what your taxes are likely to be. We just sent ours a few weeks ago. And no matter where you live in Florida, you should have received yours by now if you own property in the state. Now, once we send that notice out, property owners have 25 days to file an appeal. And that's what that appeal deadline is. And then in November, the tax collector sends out the actual tax bill. So that's really just a brief summary of the key dates related to property tax in the state of Florida. Now, this is the property tax formula in Florida, and I'm sorry to show you formulas after lunch, but as I'll explain later, this formula is really simplified because property tax has become a bit complicated over the years. Generally, we estimate market value, we subtract any caps, which brings us to the assessed value, and then we subtract any exemptions, which brings us to taxable value. Finally, a millage rate or tax rate is applied against that taxable value, and that's what determines the actual taxes. Seems kind of simple, but as you're going to soon see, there's a lot of moving parts to those values nowadays in Florida. But before we get into those things, I just want to take a little step back in time to see how we got to the current property tax system. So let's go all the way back to 1839. When ad valorem taxation was first created in Florida. Now, Florida wasn't even a state yet, so that actually didn't happen until 1845, but that didn't stop them from collecting taxes. As the slide says, ad valorem is a Latin term that means according to value. And you can see there on the bottom of the slide that tax rates were pretty favorable way back in 1839. So moving forward in 1885, the law was refined a little bit and certain exemptions were first introduced, such as government buildings and churches and widows with dependent children. But most importantly, the legislature understood the need for taxes to be uniform and equal. In other words, it's not enough that we property appraisers get the value correct. We also must ensure that it's uniform and fair, meaning that similar properties are assessed about the same. Now, I think sometimes we forget that 100 years ago, people didn't have computers or calculators or frankly, even air conditioning. Back then, everything was done by hand, a monumental task when you think about it. And this page is an excerpt of the 1911 Palm Beach County tax rolls where I work. You can see it was just all handwritten back in those days. Now, in 1929, the Great Depression hit the United States, and certainly Florida was not spared. Many people were at risk at losing their homes because they couldn't pay their property tax. So because of the Great Depression, the state of Florida introduced the homestead exemption. The Great Depression was the cause of much suffering, but I guess one good thing that came out of it was the creation of the homestead exemption. That first homestead exemption was a $5,000 exemption on a home's value. Now that doesn't seem like much today, but way back then, it probably made a lot of homes completely exempt from taxes. Now in 1960, the homestead exemption was increased to $10,000. And then in 1980, it was bumped up again to $25,000. In 1992, the Save Our Homes Amendment passed, which put a 3% cap on how much assessed value could go up. That was the first time assessments were capped in Florida, and that remains in place today. Now, in 1999, the seniors exemption was created, which gave a break to low-income seniors. Now, although that was a pretty good thing for seniors, it caused a lot of headaches for property appraisers. Before this senior exemption law passed, there was just one market value, one assessed value, and one taxable value for every property. This new senior exemption changed that. The senior exemption can be adopted by individual cities or not, and it does not have to be adopted by any of them. So in my counties, Palm Beach County, the city of Wellington adopted the senior exemption of $50,000, while the city of Royal Palm Beach adopted a $5,000 senior exemption. Many of our cities didn't adopt the senior exemption at all. So it really depends on where you live. But what really complicated things for assessors is that because this new exemption created a situation where you can have multiple taxable values on one property. On the screen is an example that shows the three different taxable values for the same property because of the way that the cities adopt the seniors exemption. So unfortunately, this has added a little confusion, but that's just the way the law works. And there's other exemptions that have happened since that are also what we call jurisdictional specific. And that creates a possibility for lots of different values. Now, 2008 was a really big year in property tax world. There was a number of new laws that passed that year. A second homestead exemption was added. But what made this one different is that the second homestead exemption of $25,000 only applied to values starting at $50,000. This was done to ensure that properties that were assessed less than 50 were not fully exempt. When they passed that first 25,000 exemption way back when, a lot of properties were assessed less than 25 and they didn't pay anything. So when they passed this law, they said the first 25,000 exemption applies, and then the second 25 doesn't kick in till you hit a value of 50,000. So they did that to make sure everybody paid a little bit. I'm going to explain a little bit more about that later. But notice on the slide that this second homestead exemption does not apply to school board taxes. 2008 also brought something called portability to Florida, which allows you to transfer your cap savings to another homestead. I'll be explaining that a little bit later as well. This also provided a $25,000 exemption for personal property. This was done to help small businesses in Florida, and it essentially made most very small businesses exempt from property taxes for their personal property. Lastly, in 2008, we got a 10% cap on non-homestead properties. That last one, that 10% cap, that also brought a lot of confusion to the property tax system because they decided that particular cap would also not be applied to the school board millage. So a lot of buckets that hold different values in the state of Florida, and it gets kind of confusing. Now, you remember that I mentioned that the senior exemption brought about the possibility of multiple taxable values on one property. Well, the changes in 2008 with the new 10% cap, that brought the possibility of more than one assessed value as well. So here's an example on the screen. A property has a market value of $900,000, but an assessed value of $600,000. That means that it was capped at 10% and the market value was rising faster than the assessed. Now, the assessed value for all the taxing authorities, except the school board, would be $600,000 because they all recognize a 10% cap. But the school board assesses at full market value. They do not participate in the 10% cap. That's kind of shown on the slide here at the bottom. I hope you're not confused yet, but if you are, I kind of feel your pain. So now in Florida, one property can have multiple assessed values, multiple taxable values, and that's really complicated the system and caused, unfortunately, a lot of confusion, even for taxpayers. A taxpayer might call our office and say, hey, what's my taxable value? And the answer is, well, that depends. It depends on what taxing authority you're asking about, because your taxable value might be different for the school board than it is for, say, the city. So for many properties, we now have different assessed and taxable values. So unfortunately, it has gotten a little bit confusing. Now, Florida property appraisers do not have the authority to assess properties any way that they want. You're not going to see any political ads where the candidate for property appraiser says, I'm going to cut your taxes in half. They just can't do that because there's many laws that govern how we assess value in the state of Florida. And the number one authority is the Florida Constitution. That beats out all others, and why I have it right on top here. Then you work your way down the list here to the Florida statutes, the administrative code, the Florida Department of Revenue, court cases, and even local laws and ordinances. So there's a lot of things that we have to keep in mind when we're valuing property in the state of Florida. There's a lot of oversight and constant change in our business. Each year, there's always new bills proposed in the legislature that aim to change something about the property tax system. And we watch those bills very closely, and we weigh in with our professional organizations and lobbyists to try to give them a little perspective before they pass these bills. Sometimes there's unintended consequences that can really cause havoc in the property tax system. Now, Florida property appraisers do a million things, but I think you can boil it down to these three main tasks. We maintain county ownership, property data and mapping. We value all the properties in the county, and we apply any exemptions and caps that might be applicable. Now, for the rest of this presentation, we're going to drill into each one of these three areas and get a little bit deeper understanding of how the system works. By the way, that photo there is my boss, Dorothy Jacks, the Palm Beach property appraiser. She was getting sworn in at the beginning of her first term way back in 2017. I think she might be with us on the presentation today. So that's just a little presentation tip. Always include a photo of your boss in your slides. Okay. So let's talk about that first task, maintaining ownership, property data, and mapping. This is a very, very important task because we want to ensure our ownership records are correct. It's critical that the property owner receives their trim notices, their tax bills, and other documents. So we have to make sure that our ownership records are correct so that we mail all that stuff to the right place. So the most common way that we determine ownership is through recorded deeds. Deeds are the primary source of ownership data for our office. I'm sure many of you own homes, and when you bought or sold them, you went to a title company and maybe an attorney's office where you signed like 1,000 documents. And one of those documents was a deed, which legally transferred the property from the seller to the buyer. So after the closing, the title company records the deed at the clerk of the court. And once they do that, we receive that deed electronically and we review it to determine how we should change our records. Excuse me. We also obtain property data by inspecting properties, as I'm sure you know. We have to collect physical information about a property because those features are just are the same things that buyer and sellers consider when they buy and sell properties. When people take out permits, such as a permit for a new home, we get that permit electronically from the appropriate city, and then we go out and we take a look at the property. That's the most effective way to make sure we have the size of the home and other characteristics correct. We actually drive out and wrap a tape around the building, take pictures and all of that. We're actually required by law to inspect properties at least once every 5 years. And in most cases, we end up inspecting properties more often, such as when a building permit's taken out or when a property sells, or even when the owner requests that we come out and take a look at something when they feel like maybe their assessment's a little bit too high. So for us to be able to accurately assess value, we need to know all these characteristics so that we can factor them into our value. We also want to make sure that taxpayers know that we're valuing these properties correctly. Now, Florida law changed a few years ago, and it now allows us to conduct those mandatory 5-year inspections using aerial photography. We have a variety of what we call desktop review software that allows us to view a property from many different angles sitting right at our desk. This photo is one of our appraisers using that desktop review software, and it allows us to see the aerial photo, an oblique photo. An oblique is when you're looking at a photo from an angle. a street view photo, and even the sketch of the property, all on the same screen. Very, very helpful for us. Here's a much better view of that software. And as you can see, our appraisers can zoom in and out. They could spin a property around and look at it from many different angles. And I have to tell you, in some cases, we can actually see a property better using this software than if we actually tried to drive out and visit the property in person. That can happen with gated communities or rural properties where they're fenced and we just can't get in. And by the way, a property owner does not have to let the property appraiser on their property. We do not have the legal right to go marching on somebody's property without their permission. So some people prefer that we not be there, understandably. And for those situations, we can certainly use the aerial photography and other tools like this to make sure that we have all the physical data correct. Now, we discovered how the property appraiser's office maintains ownership records and property data and mapping. But let's go to that second big task that Florida property appraisers must perform. And that's actually valuing property. A lot of people think we use a crystal ball or a black box to value property, but in reality, we take valuation very seriously, and I'm going to explain how we accomplish what I consider to be a pretty daunting task. But before I can describe how we value the property, we have to identify exactly what value are we estimating. As I mentioned earlier, there are actually three values now that the property appraiser must track. You have just value, often called market value, and that's how much the property appraiser estimates that you could sell your property for in the open market. We have assessed value, which is market value less any assessment limitations, like the 3% cap or the 10% cap. And then we have taxable value, which is really just the assessed value less any exemptions that might be applicable to a property. And then once we have that taxable value, it's multiplied times the tax rate, and that results in the actual taxes that are paid on a property. Now, all three of these values require specific analysis and detailed formulas that I'm going to try to explain a little bit today. So let's jump right into market value. And I'm sorry about this very wordy slide, but this comes straight from the Florida Constitution and the Florida Administrative Code. In reality, the Florida Constitution calls market value just value. But when you read the definition of just value in the Florida Administrative Code, it sounds a lot like the definition of market value. Many people think that our just value and true market value are different. They're so used to seeing assessments below the true market value that they think maybe that's the law in Florida, that we are required to be at some percentage below true value. But in fact, just value and market value are exactly the same. And that issue was actually litigated in court many years ago when a taxpayer felt like the assessed value was something, that the just value was something less than true market value. And that was a case called, Walter versus Schuler. It slipped my mind for a second, way back in 1965. And the Florida Supreme Court heard arguments from both sides, and they ultimately ruled that in Florida, just value and market value are exactly the same thing. So you'll see those terms used pretty much interchangeably, and that's what I'll be doing today. Now, since the courts have declared just value and market value the same, I'm going to just use that term market value during this presentation since everybody kind of knows what that means. The property appraiser's estimate of market value is essentially what they think the property could sell for on the open market. Now, we certainly tend to be conservative. Our values are generally conservative because we don't want to be so precise that we overshoot and end up over-assessing a property. So in most counties, the property appraiser's estimate of market value is somewhere around 80 to 85% of what it's truly worth. The Department of Revenue gives Florida property appraisers a little bit of latitude on those values, and that just makes it a lot easier for the property appraiser to hit the target, and it does give the taxpayer a little bit of a break on what properties are really worth. Now, if you own a property, you've probably obtained a mortgage and that bank probably ordered an appraisal. And when that bank appraiser came out to your house, they measured the property, they walked around, took pictures, they came in and sketched out a floor plan. Then they drove around the neighborhood and took photos of their comparable sales. And they went back to the office and spent the rest of the day writing up the appraisal, doing the analysis. Most appraisers in the what we call the fee world can do about one good residential appraisal a day. Well, the property appraiser has thousands of properties to appraise each year, actually 670,000 here in Palm Beach County. So we don't have the luxury of doing appraisals one at a time like that bank appraiser. Instead, we use something called mass appraisal. And mass appraisal is basically automating the process that same bank appraiser uses. We use a computer system to do that, which we call a CAMA system. And CAMA is just an acronym for Computer Assisted Mass Appraisal. Now, as the slide says, that CAMA system helps us track all the properties, value them, apply all the caps and exemptions, and all the things I'm going to tell you about today. This is just a screenshot from the CAMA system we use, and it has everything you can imagine related to a property, exemptions, caps, all that stuff. So that's how we value these properties. Now, we do everything that bank appraiser does. We don't take any shortcuts, except instead of looking at one property at a time, we value hundreds and even thousands at one time. We automate the process, just like you see in the slide here with the cars coming off the assembly line. Interestingly, the banks are actually moving in the same direction with something called automated valuation models, usually abbreviated AVMs. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Zillow, where you can look up your own property and see the estimate of value that Zillow says your home is worth. The banks are doing the same thing. They're starting to create these automated valuation models, and they're trying to lower the lending costs for their customers and eliminating a lot of the traditional appraisals. So these AVMs have really put an impact and put a dent in some of the private appraiser business. Now, one of the questions we're often asked at the property appraiser's office is, how do you estimate the value of my property? And the answer really depends on the property type. But in general terms, we use the same standard 3 approaches to value that all appraisers use, even those bank appraisers. Those 3 approaches to value are the sales comparison approach, which we often call the market approach, the cost approach, and the income approach. Those are the 3 approaches to value in the appraisal world. Now, the sales comparison approach, which we often call the market approach, it's probably the most common and one that everybody's pretty familiar with. This approach utilizes sales of similar properties to estimate value. That's the approach typically used on single-family homes, condos, duplexes, vacant land, and really most residential property. It can also be used for commercial properties, but really it's generally more applied to residential. So if you've had an appraisal done on your home, you probably remember seeing an appraisal, and in the back of the appraisal, there's a sales grid with sales in the neighborhood and adjustments for differences. So we utilize that same type of sales comparison approach, and we use it extensively in the property appraiser's office, especially for residential properties. Now, for many commercial properties, the property appraiser utilizes the income approach. Although these types of properties do sell, they don't sell very often, and you just don't have the volume of sales to really analyze a property the way you do with residential. More importantly, when these commercial properties are bought and sold, the price is often negotiated based on the property's ability to generate income. So investors who buy these types of properties are really much more interested in the property's financial performance than what other properties are selling for. So because of that, our office also uses the same approach when we value these types of properties. And you can see some examples there on the slide. Obviously, regional malls, hotels, apartment complexes, and certainly industrial properties, all based on income. Now, there are some properties that rarely, if ever, sell. So the sales comparison approach and the income approach I just told you about really don't work very well for those. Instead, for what we call special purpose properties, we utilize the cost approach. And as you can see from my slide, that would include sports stadiums, churches, and power plants. The cost approach is a method where you estimate what it would actually cost to replace the improvements, and then we depreciate it for age and condition. By the way, that church there on the slide, that's the Sacred Heart Church in Tampa. My wife and I got married there 37 years ago this year. Now for many, whoops, I've got an extra slide here. Okay, so we covered market value, we covered the three approaches. So let's jump into assessed value. Some people use the term as assessed value kind of generically to mean their property tax value, but in Florida, assessed value has a very specific meaning. As you can see from this slide, there are two things that mostly impact assessed value: the 3% homestead exemption cap and the 10% non-homestead exemption cap. We're going to talk about both of those and how they might affect assessed value. So let's start with the homestead exemption. You may recall from earlier that homestead exemption began during the Depression in Florida and has changed several times over those years. But as of today, a homestead exemption provides a $50,000 exemption. And most importantly, it also provides a cap on how much the assessment can be increased. As number 2 on the slide here says, when someone has homestead, assessed value cannot go up more than 3% a year, or the change in the consumer price index, often called CPI, whichever is less. So as a result, many taxpayers get a little bit of a tax break on their property because of that cap. Now in 2008, the state of Florida also passed another benefit related to homestead, and it allows taxpayers to carry that tax break or their cap savings with them to their next homestead. That's called portability, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Now, in terms of homestead, there are certain rules and requirements to obtain and keep the exemption in Florida. The first is that you must own and occupy the home on January 1st of the tax year. So if you buy a home in November and you file for homestead, it's not going to go into effect until January 1st when you own the home and actually occupy it on that date. Now, you cannot rent your home for more than 30 days a year. And when a property sells, the cap is completely reset and the new buyer starts over. Now that rental part, that number 2, is a little tricky in Florida because having a homestead exemption doesn't prevent you from, say, renting a room in your house to a roommate. Where some people cross the line is where they rent their entire home for extended periods of time. You know, the property appraiser gets a little jumpy when he sees your home that's supposed to have homestead on Airbnb. It doesn't mean you can't rent a room out, but when we start seeing the entire house rented, that's a red flag and a big no-no, and it could cause a loss of homestead. And that could be a big loss because the 3% cap is very advantageous and you wouldn't want to lose it. And when homestead comes off, that cap is reset. So let me try to explain the 3% cap with this very busy chart. And it looks pretty daunting, but I think I can explain it. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner where that green and red line come together, that's when a property is initially purchased and the owner files for homestead. At that particular moment, the assessed value and the market value are exactly the same. Now, let's say the market is very robust, like it is right now, and values are increasing rapidly, as shown by that red line, which is market value. You can see from years 1 through 3, the value went up sharply as that red line increased. But at the same time, the assessed value, which is the green line, stayed steady, increasing no more than 3% a year, or that change in CPI. You can see that even though the value, the red line, is going up rapidly, the assessed value, the green line, is steady and slow at 3% max. Now notice in year 5, the market value began falling and eventually fell all the way down to the level of the assessed value. Once that happened, assessed value fell with market value because assessed value can never be higher than market value. Then in years 7 and 8, the market started climbing again, and we see the whole process start over. By the way, that gap anywhere on the slide between the green line and the red line, those are the cap savings that can be carried with you to a new homestead. That's that portability. So as I said, assessed value increases are limited to 3% or the change in the CPI, whichever is less. So we get that change in the Consumer Price Index from the Department of Revenue every single year. And you'll notice on the slide here, for the past 9 years, that change in CPI has been less than 3%. So that became the max increase in those particular years. For this year, 2021, the max increase is 1.4%. That's the most assessed value can go up anywhere in the state of Florida for homestead properties. Now, remember that slide with the busy graph I just showed you that showed that gap between market value and assessed value? Well, that gap is called cap savings that can be transferred from one homestead to the next. This is one of the greatest benefits of homestead. That's a huge benefit for taxpayers, and it provides a substantial tax break for people who are selling a home, especially if they've lived there a long time and they have a large gap between their market value and their assessed value. There are some rules associated with portability that you have to keep in mind. You must have a homestead on both the old home and the new home. Both homes must be in Florida. You can't transfer cap savings from Florida to New York or vice versa. And you must have a cap to transfer. Seems kind of simple, but some people apply for portability only to find out that their market value and their assessed value are exactly the same, and they really don't have any cap savings. That usually happens when somebody hasn't lived in a home very long or long enough to really widen that gap. Now, there's also a time frame of 3 years that you must apply for portability after selling your home, and that's 3 tax years. So I always tell people you can go 2 years without homestead after selling your home, and then you must reapply to be able to transfer your cap savings. Now, the last provision is that, well, I think you can also see on the slide here that the most you can transfer is $500,000, even if you have cap savings much higher than that. That's the max you can take with you, $500,000. Now, that very last provision is that the amount that you transfer depends on whether you're buying a more expensive home than you're leaving or a cheaper home than the one you sold. If you're buying a more expensive home, we call that an upsize, and you can bring your entire cap savings with you up to $500,000. But if you're buying a less expensive home, then a formula kicks in that will tell you how much of the portability you can take with you. The legislature did that because they were afraid some people might have tax savings of, say, $500,000, and then they go out and buy a $300,000 condo and they pay no taxes. So they have prevented that by kicking in a formula if you buy a less expensive home than the one that you're leaving. Okay. Now, in 2008, the law also changed that brought a 10% cap to any property that doesn't have a homestead exemption. So now every property with one small exemption has some kind of a cap. That one small exemption is agricultural properties, which I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes. But let's talk about the 10% cap for just a second. It's a lot like the 3% cap for homestead properties, but there are some differences. For example, no application is required. And just like the homestead, when the property sells, the 10% cap comes off. Unfortunately, there is no portability for the 10% cap. When you sell, the cap just goes away. You'll notice that last bullet point that the 10% cap does not apply to the school board. And this has created a little confusion because people think that their taxes can't go up more than 10%. And that's not true because the 10% cap does not apply to the school board. So when people say there's a 10% cap on non-homestead properties, it's not really a 10% cap because about 40% of the tax bill goes to schools. So that value is not limited by that 10% cap. That can be a little confusing sometimes. Now that covers homestead and non-homestead, but I want to talk about the agricultural classification in Florida. And these are properties that are not capped at all. And in Florida, you can get a pretty generous tax break if you farm your property. Many years ago, the legislature realized that if they didn't give farmers some kind of tax break, they were more inclined to sell their properties to developers. So they came up with this agricultural classification, which requires the property appraiser's office to value the property based on the actual agriculture use and not on what we call highest and best use, which might be what a developer would pay for the property. Now, to qualify for the ag classification, it has to be a bona fide commercial operation. So if you have a pet cow in your backyard, you're probably not going to get the ag exemption or classification. Same with a backyard garden, it really has to be a farming business. Unlike homestead and non-homestead properties, ag properties are not protected by any assessments caps, but they really don't need it because their values are usually pretty low because of that classification. Now, I'd probably be remiss if I didn't also mention that there's an assessment on tangible personal property in the state of Florida. We often call it TPP. These are the personal property assets owned and used by a business. When you walk into a restaurant, for example, all the tables, chairs, kitchen equipment, those are all separately assessed from the real estate. The TPP has a separate parcel number and tax bill, although it is taxed at the same exact tax rate as real estate. Now, as the slide indicates, anybody with a TPP assessment greater than $25,000 in value must file a return with the property appraiser's office every year, and they have to list all of their business assets on that return. So in Florida, we have a $25,000 exemption for personal property. That pretty much wipes out the assessment for most very, very small businesses, which was the intention when the legislature passed it. In fact, if the assessment is less than $25,000, they don't even have to file a return with the property appraiser's office unless they acquire more assets that push their value over $25,000. So that covers the market value and the assessed value. So the last value that the property appraiser estimates is the taxable value. Now, taxable value is just simply the assessed value less any exemptions. There's a lot of property tax exemptions in Florida, including the homestead exemption that we talked about, but there's a lot more. You can read the list on the slide here, and this isn't even a complete list. There are exemptions or tax breaks for disabled folks, the military, widows and widowers, low-income seniors, and many others. Quite a few exemptions available to Florida property owners. Now, most Florida property appraisers, including our office, have websites with lots of information on each of these exemptions and others. So you should be able to find plenty of information about any of them if you're interested. Now, after the property appraiser provides the taxing authorities with an estimate of taxable value for the year, they estimate their tax rate, or what's often called the millage rate. That's what determines how much actual taxes you're going to pay. You might even see articles in the paper in the last week and maybe even the coming week where it says things like Delray Beach votes to not increase property taxes, and they keep their millage rate or tax rate the same. Well, in many cases, they don't have to increase their tax rate because we've increased values significantly. We think that they should lower their millage rate to offset the increased values, but what a lot of cities do is just simply adopt their rate from last year, and that keeps the millage rate the same, but it obviously can cause taxes to go up. So when the cities vote on their millage rate, they provide those millage rates to us, and we publish those on this TRIM notice. And TRIM is an acronym for Truth in Millage. And the TRIM notice provides taxpayers with all the values estimated by the property appraiser's office, along with the proposed taxes based on those millage rates. It's not an actual tax bill, and you can see that in the top right. Do not pay. This is not a bill. It's just really an early heads up. and it gives the taxpayer an idea of what's coming when they get their actual tax bills in November. Now, also on that trim notice is a list of public hearings where the taxing authorities will vote on their final millage rates. So the millage rates on the trim notice are still proposed. Then they have these final hearings and they vote to make them official. And I can tell you from my experience, when people show up and voice their concerns, oftentimes the elected officials will adjust those tax rates down. But generally, what we typically see is that nobody shows up at those meetings and the tax rates stay the same. Now, as I mentioned early on, all Florida property appraisers sent their trim notices out in the past couple of weeks. So if you own a property in Florida, you should have received one of these by now. This notice also kicks off a 25-day deadline to file an appeal if you're unhappy with your values. So when taxpayers receive their trim notice, they have 25 days to file an appeal. So here in Palm Beach County, that deadline was this past Monday, the 13th. And after that date, then they have to file a late petition and they have to have some extenuating circumstances to support why they weren't able to file on time. Now, the Value Adjustment Board, where all these appeals are heard, is overseen by the clerk of the court, not the property appraiser. It wouldn't be quite fair if the property appraiser oversees the appeal process, so that job falls to the clerk of the court. Now, if a taxpayer decides to file an appeal, they can usually do that online in most counties, and the cost is typically around $15. Once you file, you'll receive a hearing notice like this one, and it gives you the date and the time for a hearing where you can express your concerns about the value. Now, prior to that hearing, you have the right to meet with the property appraiser's office to discuss your value. If the property appraiser agrees that your value is wrong, they can voluntarily adjust it. And I think I can speak for most property appraisers when I say that we welcome the opportunity to correct those errors. We know we're not going to get all values right. We value thousands and thousands of properties every year, and sometimes one or two or a few slip through the cracks. And so we don't hesitate to fix those assessments when there's something wrong. So if you think there's something amiss with your property, don't hesitate to call your property appraiser's office. I think you'll find them quite cooperative. Now, if the property appraiser does not agree and does not want to lower the value, the hearing will go on. And before the hearing, both sides will exchange evidence, so each one knows what the other side is going to say. It's kind of like court in some respects, in that each side must provide the other side with evidence and what witnesses might attend, but it is very informal. By law, the taxpayer has to provide the property appraiser evidence within 14 days of the hearing, and the property appraiser must provide theirs back within 7 days of the hearing. So the hearing, like I said, is pretty informal, usually held in a conference room. This photo is from an actual hearing with the employees of the property appraiser on the left and two tax agents on the right, and the special magistrate who makes the ultimate decision sitting there in the center. The special magistrate is a local appraiser hired by the Value Adjustment Board, and the person makes the ultimate decision about the value. That decision is binding. However, if the taxpayer is unsuccessful at this level, they can file a suit in circuit court. Now, I mentioned tax agents in the state of Florida, and actually most states. A lot of commercial properties are represented by professional tax agents. It can be a fairly lucrative business, and they are very sophisticated, and it requires our appraisers also to match that sophistication. And there can be some very, very interesting hearings on some high-end commercial properties sometimes. Now, in November, the tax collector sends out the actual tax bill. This tells you how much you owe and includes both ad valorem and something called non-ad valorem assessments. In some taxing districts, non-ad valorem taxes are levied as well. And non-ad valorem assessments are things like fees for special services like solid waste disposal, water management, sewers, stormwater, street lights, all kinds of special improvements. We've seen more and more of those in the last few years creeping in. You can see both the ad valorem and the non-ad valorem on this tax bill example that I have right here on the screen. Now, tax payments in Florida are due on April 1st based on the prior year values. So the tax bills for 2020 were due on April of 2021. Now, you can get a discount if you pay your taxes early. So when the tax collector sends out those notices in November, if you pay in November, you get a 4% discount. And as you can see on the slide, that declines by 1% every month until the actual payment is due. Well, my time is just about up. So let me summarize what we've covered here. We talked about the history of property tax in Florida and the duties of the Florida property appraisers. We discussed the three approaches to value: the cost, the market, and the income approach. We also discussed the three types of value that property appraisers estimate: market, assessed, and taxable. We reviewed the homestead 3% cap and portability and the non-homestead 10% cap. And we covered the agricultural exemption and personal property assessments. And lastly, we walked through the trim process, filing appeals, and ultimately taxes. It seemed like a lot in 1 hour. So with that, I hope everybody got something out of it, or at least a nice restful nap this afternoon. But either way, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Tim, thank you. And I guess my opening was spot on, because it is confusing, and I would think just from a volume standpoint, almost overwhelming. I got a couple of questions, if you don't mind. The first one of those deals with the ag exemption. And there was years and years ago, this whole issue of renting a cow and putting them on your property and getting that ag exemption. And even out where I live, at one point, I'm not going to say who the developer was or is, that in the middle of the night, we saw some cows and some donkeys had gotten out, and they were confined to a property next to the school. I looked it up on the property appraiser's website and found out it was the developer who owned the land and obviously had placed the cattle there. So can you just talk about what the requirements are, and does that get abused very much?
Yeah, well, the developers that own these properties are very sophisticated, and they hire attorneys who understand the laws in the state of Florida. And obviously, when vacant land is sitting there, it's not generating any income like a shopping center. So it behooves them to try to reduce their property tax as much as they can, because again, they're not bringing any revenue. So what they'll do is they'll go out and hire real farmers. There are people who specialize in cattle grazing, and these real farmers will sign a lease. The lease is usually for $1 a year or something like that. The farmer gets to use that land essentially for free, and then the developer can gain the benefits of the agricultural classification. Even though we realize that the motivation is to reduce the taxes, as long as the farmer is doing all the right things and they are a true bona fide business, they will receive that agricultural exemption or classification. But as soon as things happen like you described, where cattle are getting out and they're not maintaining their fencing and things like that, then we don't hesitate to remove that classification and try to bring them back in line. But it is something that developers and attorneys are quite aware of. They understand the law, and the ones that are good practitioners will make sure that they hire a very good and qualified, bona fide farmer. And for those, we certainly apply the classification.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, those cows went away after about 3 months. So yeah. The other question I have is on commercial properties. And I'm assuming for most of those, you're using the income approach. And for some of that, how, giving the number of commercial properties you may have, for example, in Palm Beach County, how do you get access to that income in order to make the proper valuation?
That's a great question. We actually send out a survey every year to all commercial property owners, asking them for their rental rates, vacancy, expenses, and that sort of thing. But we're fortunate here in Palm Beach County. It's a large county. It's large cities in the county. There's a lot of industry information available to us. industry reports about multifamily, industrial, office properties. So we generally know, and to estimate the value, for example, in downtown West Palm Beach, we develop what we call income models. So for Class A commercial office space, we might be using a rental rate of $30 a square foot, whereas when you get out in the suburbs, the office rental rates might be $15 a square foot. But we apply those models in mass so that similar Class A office buildings have similar assessments. But you've really hit it on the head, because there's a lot of states that actually require property owners to provide that income data, but not in the state of Florida. It's voluntary.
Good. Maybe one more question, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on the Save Our Homes cap. There was, of course, in 2008, when the portability issue was brought up, there were all these examples about the fairness issue of the long-term property owner who has been sitting there enjoying that 3% cap for 15, 16 years. His neighbor who moved in at the same time, 15 years later, sells the property, that cap gets removed, and now one guy is paying a rate of this and the next guy is paying a rate of that, the new person that bought the property.
Yeah.
Can you just talk about, not just from a fairness perspective, but just what's that mean from the assessment process?
You bet. And we get that question every year. And Eric, that issue has actually been litigated in Florida many times. There's even been attempts to generate class action suits on this issue. They have all failed. So far, the law in Florida is that it's perfectly acceptable for Florida property appraisers to apply that cap to homestead properties and remove it when the property sells. Of course, there's a tremendous benefit with the portability to be able to take it to the next property. But you're right. I mean, it's certainly understandable when somebody moves down here from up north and they buy a home that has taxes of $10,000 a year, and they look next door and the owner's paying $2,000 a year. But that's the way the system works here in Florida. And if that owner paying $10,000 waits long enough, they'll certainly be able to garner that same benefit over time.
Great, thank you. I think we have any other questions? Maybe the last question I have is, and you may not be able to answer this, but it was on one of your first slides, it just talked about the tax burden per state. We've got New Jersey is the highest property tax, and then Florida at number 22. Do you have a sense for what's the difference in those? Because I don't know what the population is for New Jersey, but I'm assuming that perhaps Florida has a broader base, and that's kind of keeps the valuations down. I don't know. Do you have any insight on that?
You know, I really don't, Eric. I do know that in some states, they don't value properties every year like we do in Florida. That's a tremendous advantage for us because we're forced to keep up with the market. So in some of these northern states, they have like a 5-year reassessment cycle. And then all of a sudden somebody gets a tax bill and it's, 5 times more than the last one. And they raise hell. And next thing you know, the legislature is forcing the assessor to reassess and all this kind of crazy stuff. So I can't quite explain why they're so much higher than us, but I think being able to assess annually helps us keep that market nice and steady.
Well, I think we get a better deal from both the tax perspective and just the environment and the climate and the whole scenery. Yep. So, Tim, we don't have any other questions. I appreciate your time this afternoon. Thanks for coming on, and hopefully we can talk again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. Enjoyed it.